Well, as we all know, the Black Lives Matter movement has also reignited cancel culture. And you can define this many ways, but it is extreme political correctness aimed at rewriting history, bringing down Western culture. As part of that, statues of the likes of Captain James Cook have been defaced, and a loud minority are calling for their destruction. It's mad. It shows a brainless appreciation for what he, the navigator, actually achieved in history and what he filed in his journals, which is the evidence. Well, the latest council to get in on this trendy rewriting of history is the Council of Anchorage in Alaska. Yes, long way away from here, but a place where Cook sailed to in his third major voyage in 1770 to map the famous northwest trade route. But 232 years later, Indigenous leaders there have called for a prominent statue of Cook to be removed. In response, the local council, led by a Democrat, has decided to leave it to the Indigenous community to decide what to do with the monument. The Mayor of Anchorage is Ethan Berkowitz, and I caught up with him earlier in the week. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure to be with you, even from so far away.
You are so far away. Over the many years that you have been a civic official in Anchorage, how many times would you have been in the presence of the Cook statue for various openings and launches and ceremonies?
It's not so much for those kind of ceremonies. We take visitors there every now and then when we get someone who wants to get a good view of Anchorage. We take them by the Cook statue.
So, in hindsight, what were you up to when you were doing that? You should have thought better about that, shouldn't you?
I did think better of it at the time, but it's the view from there is spectacular. That's why they put the statue where it is. Has a commanding view of Cook Inlet and Mount Denali, which is the largest mountain in North America.
I've looked back at the times and the places that Cook experienced and discovered in 1778, and I haven't found that he committed any crimes at the time. Have you?
Well, it's not that he did, but his crew wasn't so good when they were here. Cook himself never came ashore in Anchorage, but his crew, and I believe it was Lieutenant Bly who shot a dog here, and they did some things they shouldn't have done in an effort to intimidate the locals.
Intimidated the locals, but it wasn't Cook.
It was not Cook himself, but it was his crew.
You know, he was trying to find the Northwest Trading Passage, and he was in that inlet thinking that maybe there was a way through there. And so after 2 weeks, he left. He is one of the greatest navigators and seamen in history.
Beyond a doubt, he was an absolutely terrific navigator, and what he did as a mariner is one of the most remarkable achievements that we can look back on historically.
And especially,
but I think there's more.
And especially where you come from, he was able to fill in so many blank spaces on the map up and down that northern coast.
Well, that's the thing about it. They were blank to him because he didn't know, but there were people here when he arrived, and it wasn't blank to them.
Yeah, but they weren't producing maps to keep people safe when they travelled along the coast. He was the one who made sure he was able to plot the coast so that travellers in future could know exactly where to go and what to avoid.
Well, I think the bathymetric maps that he was doing were all very useful, but the way finding that the local people used worked well for them. And if you look at some of the indigenous travelers, they traveled across the Pacific long before the Europeans did. So they had an excellent system of navigation. It's just that that's been lost a little bit in the retelling of history.
But wouldn't it be a consideration to build monuments that recognise Indigenous establishment there, as opposed to thinking that one statue has to go down to recognise another group of people? It doesn't sound fair, especially to Cook, who went there to try and find this Northwest Trading Passage. He didn't go there to kill.
It's less about Cook himself than it is about the symbolism of somebody who launched a colonial enterprise. And I think what happens in the telling of the story of Captain Cook, which is an incomplete story, the telling of the story of the Indigenous people has been forgotten. And the effort that's being made here, and I suspect in Australia as well, is they want a more complete telling of history, one that fairly represents that there was a history before Cook showed up and after the 2 weeks when he was here.
But so maybe this is the fault of civic leaders like yourself, who should be putting up the statues and the monuments to recognise their existence there prior to Cook, not pulling down Cook's statue.
Well, thank you very much for giving civic leaders credit for it. But I would also suspect that journalists such as yourself have a hand in the telling of history and the telling of current events, too. So culpability can be shared.
OK, but culpability in terms of, hey, a little bit of Indigenous history doesn't hurt anyone. That's fantastic. But it doesn't mean you have to take someone else's history and their accomplishments and their monument down to prove it.
Well, so what's happening here is less a desire to take it down than to set up a process so we can put it in context. And what we did here was recognize that the setting up of the Cook statue did it without consulting the indigenous tribe that was here, from the Dena'ina Athabascan people. And so we set up a process so they will make a decision about the fate of the statue. Perhaps they'll contextualize it, maybe they'll turn it around, maybe they'll move it. We're waiting to see what that process yields.
What if they say he should be dragged down and lost forever?
I don't think that's what they're going to do. There's a recognition here that Cook played a role in introducing Europe to Alaska. But I also think there's a need to rectify some of the past historic injustice. And we wanted to set up a process so that as we were combating some of the structural issues of injustice, we were setting up a process that led to more structural justice heading into the future.
I read somewhere where Cook should actually be applauded for getting to that inlet, which is named after him, before the Russians, because after he came there were lots of American and British ships and people who came to the area, and it was probably best in hindsight that we had British and American people there and not the Russians, Mayor.
Well, we did have the Russians come through here, and they weren't particularly kind to indigenous people either. And so there's a sordid history that most peoples can tell about their first contact with indigenous peoples. And Captain Cook, I would never take away from the skills he showed and the cartographic knowledge he brought, but there's more to the telling of history than just the story of one man.
Very, very true. Are you supportive of rewriting history? There are some critics who might say taking down statues is simply rewriting history. And the only way you find out about the good, bad and ugly of anyone is to have it in front of you and talk about who that person is.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. But when you just tell the story of one person and don't put that person in the context of his time, you're not telling the complete story. Captain Cook came to Alaska, was here for in Cook Inlet for 2 weeks, never came ashore. You had people here who were here for thousands of years, who had a culture that was here. Telling a complete story would tell their story along with Captain Cook's. And that's just hasn't happened to the degree that it should.
Have you thought about giving a decision to the overall community that you are in charge of as opposed to just the Indigenous community? Does it make more sense allowing everyone to have a say in what should happen?
You know, when we're trying to correct past injustices where the Indigenous community wasn't consulted initially, and here the Indigenous community is sovereign. We have a government-to-government relationship between the municipality of Anchorage and the native village of Eklutna, which is the local tribe. So I think it is the correct and fair thing to do. It establishes a new process and makes sure that this government shares power with the local peoples.
But you're fairly sure or positive that it doesn't or won't end in Cook's statue coming down?
I don't think it will. I know members of the tribe. They want to have a complete process. They want to tell the story of their people and their history in a way that they can share it with the entire community. This is an opportunity for all of Anchorage and other communities who are paying attention to what we do to perhaps see that there's a way we can heal from history instead of just using it as a way of dividing.
I appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much for yours.
Well, thanks so much, and I hope we can get down and visit in person one day.
And maybe vice versa. That would be fabulous. I've never been to Alaska. They tell me it's fabulous.
It's beautiful and large, so come up.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.